A werewolf shifter romance for you. Prologue. My birth during a total solar eclipse, the prophecy of the Shadowbringer, and the moment my mother died to hide me from the Alpha's executioners. The cold realization that my existence is considered a cosmic crime. They say that when I was born, the birds stopped singing and the wind itself held its breath. It was the peak of the great summer, a day when the sun should have been a golden crown over the Shadowvale territory. My pack, the Soulblood, lived for the light. They worshipped the high noon sun. They believed that the stronger the rays, the purer the wolf. But as my mother's labor pains began, the sky started to bruise. A strange, unnatural twilight crept over the trees, and the temperature plummeted until the midsummer flowers were rimmed with frost. I remember none of it, yet I feel it in my marrow every day, the moment the moon slid in front of the sun, casting a shadow that didn't just darken the earth, but stained it. "She's coming," my mother, Alara, whispered. She was tucked away in a birthing cave, far from the main village, hidden by the thickest briars and the oldest enchantments. She knew. She had seen the prophecy in the embers of the hearth. A child of the void shall be born when the eye of the sky closes. Outside the cave, the pack was in an uproar. I can imagine my uncle, Alpha Varric, standing on the high rock, his golden fur bristling as he watched the sun vanish. To him, an eclipse wasn't a celestial event. It was a cosmic rot. He had his executioners ready, their silver blades unsheathed, waiting for the Shadowbringer to take their first breath so they could snuff it out. Then it happened. The world went pitch black. The ring of fire appeared in the sky, a bleeding skeletal crown. And I cried. My first scream didn't sound like a baby's wail. It sounded like a ripple in the fabric of reality. The shadows in the cave didn't just sit in the corners. They rushed toward me, wrapping around my tiny, shivering body like a silken womb of ink. "My beautiful curse," my mother breathed. She was pale, her life force draining rapidly. The birth of a Shadowbringer takes more than blood. It takes the light of the mother's own soul. She heard the heavy thud of paws outside. The sentinels had found the cave. They had smelled the ozone and the frost. "Ilara!" Varric's voice boomed, shaking the stalactites. "Hand over the abomination! The prophecy says the Shadowbringer will consume the sunblood. I will not let our lineage burn in the dark." My mother looked at me, her eyes reflecting the black sun above. She didn't cry. She reached into her chest, not with her hands, but with her remaining magic. She took the soul spark, the tiny fragment of sun energy every wolf is born with, and she didn't give it to me. She used it to create a veil. She pressed her hand to my forehead, branding me with a seal that would hide my true scent, my true power, and my true nature for 18 years. To the world, I would look like a weak, shiftless Omega. I would look like a mistake, rather than a master. "Hide," she whispered, her voice fading into the cold air. "Grow in the dark, my little Midnight, for when the veil breaks, they will realize that the shadows don't follow you. They obey you." When Varric burst into the cave, he found my mother's cold body and a small, shivering infant who smelled of nothing but ash and disappointment. He didn't see the Eclipse Queen. He saw a defect too pathetic to even kill. He spared my life that day, not out of mercy, but out of contempt. He thought he had won. He didn't realize that by letting me live in the shadows of his palace, he was just giving me a front-row seat to his downfall. The sky eventually cleared, and the sun returned. But the light was different now. It was thinner, because a part of it, the darkest, hungriest part, was now living inside me. If you've ever felt like you had to shrink yourself just to let others feel big, then you know exactly how my life felt. They didn't just want me quiet. They wanted me erased. Smash that like button if you're ready to see the Omega stop playing nice. Subscribe and stay tuned. The iron is about to break. Let's step into the cellar. Chapter 1. For 18 years, the sun was my enemy. While the rest of the Soul Blood Pack spent their days basking in the golden clearings of the valley, soaking up the radiation that fueled their shifts and brightened their fur, I lived in the architecture of the damp and the forgotten. I was the girl who moved in the periphery, the ghost of the cellars. Every morning at dawn, the ritual was the same. 2 sentinels would enter my cramped room beneath the Alpha's manor, their faces twisted in a mixture of pity and disgust. They didn't come to greet me. They came to tighten the iron. The collar was a heavy, 3-inch thick band of cold-forged iron, etched with runes of suppression that glowed a faint, sickly gold whenever I breathed too deeply. It sat heavy on my collarbones, a constant reminder of my shame. It was designed to stifle my scent and anchor my soul, preventing the eclipse rot from infecting the rest of the pack. To the soul blood, I was a walking disease, a fracture in their perfect, sunny reality. "Don't look up, Omega," the lead guard, a brute named Torin, spat as he cinched the lock. "The sun doesn't want to see your face today. Move." I didn't argue. I had learned early on that my voice was just another weapon they could use against me. I followed them out into the light, my eyes squinting against the painful glare of the morning. To me, the sun didn't feel like life. It felt like a searing, invasive heat that tried to peel the skin from my bones. My job was the shadow work. I was tasked with the things the proud warriors were too noble to touch: scrubbing the blood from the training pits, hauling the waste from the kill floors, and cleaning the soot from the chimneys. I was always covered in the grime of the pack's underside, a literal shadow in a world of blinding gold. "Look at her," I heard the whispers as I hauled a bucket of lye across the courtyard. "The shadow bringer. 18 years and still hasn't even grown a whisker of fur." "A mistake of nature," another girl laughed. Selah, the Alpha's daughter and my primary tormentor. She stood on the balcony, her hair shimmering like spun silk in the light. "My father says she's lucky he didn't throw her to the crows the day she was born. She's just a human soul trapped in a wolf's body. A defect." I kept my head down, my fingers gripping the handle of the bucket so hard the wood groaned. I could feel it then, the thing beneath the iron. Deep in the center of my chest, there was a cold, dense weight. It wasn't the warm, thumping heart of a wolf. It was a vacuum. It was a hunger. Every time Selah mocked me, every time Torin shoved me into a wall, that vacuum pulsed. The shadows at my feet would twitch, stretching out toward my tormentors like dark, reaching fingers before the iron collar hissed and burned into my neck, forcing the darkness back down. I was a prisoner in my own skin, living for the moments when the sun finally dipped below the horizon. Only at night, when the pack went to their dens and the world turned gray, did the pressure in my chest ease. Only in the dark did I feel like I could actually breathe. "Tomorrow is the great shift," Torin muttered as he threw me back into my cell at dusk, locking the iron grate. "The Alpha is going to decide what to do with you, Omega. A wolf who can't shift by 18 is a mouth we don't need to feed. Enjoy your last night of safety. If you don't turn gold tomorrow, you're out." He laughed and walked away, his torchlight flickering against the stone walls. I sat in the darkness, my hand hovering over the cold iron of my collar. I could feel the runes vibrating, struggling to contain the pressure building inside me. Tomorrow was the 18th anniversary of the eclipse. Tomorrow, the veil my mother placed on my soul would dissolve. They expected me to turn gold. They expected me to finally purify my blood and join their sun-worshipping cult. But as I looked at the sliver of moon through the high cellar window, I felt the iron start to crack. I didn't want their sun. I didn't want their gold. I wanted the world to see what happens when the shadows finally stop hiding. The high plateau was bathed in a light so bright it felt violent. It was the night of the great shift. The entire Soul Blood pack had gathered in a massive circle, their white and gold furs shimmering under a moon so large it seemed to dominate the sky. In the center of the circle stood the initiates, the 18-year-olds ready to claim their status. And then there was me, standing on the outskirts, my iron collar glowing a furious, overheated gold as it fought to keep my soul from exploding. "Tonight, we purge the shadows," Alpha Varric's voice thundered, his golden eyes fixed on me with a predatory gleam. "Tonight, the sun's chosen will rise, and those who remain in the dark will be cast out." One by one, the others began to change. It was a beautiful, rhythmic display. Sela went first, her body stretching and furring into a magnificent cream-colored wolf with eyes like amber suns. The pack howled in approval. The air was filled with the scent of pine, heat, and triumph. Then it was my turn. "Step forward, Omega," Varric commanded, his lip curling. "Show us if there is a single drop of light left in your corrupted veins. Shift or be exiled." I walked into the center of the circle. The ground felt like it was humming beneath my bare feet. As I stood under the peak of the moon's cycle, the veil my mother had placed on me 18 years ago finally reached its breaking point. I could feel it tearing, not like fabric, but like a dam bursting. I didn't feel the warmth of the wolf. I felt a cold so absolute it turned the air into ice. "Something is wrong," Sela whimpered, her golden fur standing on end. "The moon. Why is the moon turning black?" I looked up. The lunar light wasn't fading. It was being pulled toward me. I wasn't reflecting the light. I was eating it. The iron collar around my neck began to scream. The runes of suppression turned from gold to a deep, bruised purple. Then, with a sound like a mountain splitting in half, the iron shattered. The explosion didn't knock people back. It pulled them in. "I am not a wolf," I whispered, my voice echoing with the weight of 1,000 midnights. I didn't grow fur. I didn't sprout claws. My body stayed human, but it became a silhouette of shifting smoke and starlight. Behind me, the shadows of the trees and the wolves began to detach themselves from the ground. They rose up like ink-black titans, their eyes glowing with the same cold, lunar silver as mine. "Abomination!" Varric roared, lunging at me in his massive alpha form. He never reached me. I raised a single hand, and the shadow of a nearby pine tree whipped out like a lash, wrapping around his throat and lifting him 3 feet off the ground. The golden light of his aura was snuffed out the moment the darkness touched him. The village became a living nightmare. The torches died. The fires in the hearths went cold. The soul-blood warriors, who had spent their lives worshipping the light, were suddenly blind and powerless in a world where their own shadows were trying to strangle them. "The light didn't reject me," I said, walking toward my uncle as he clawed at the shadow tendril around his neck. "I rejected the light. You spent 18 years trying to keep me in the dark. You forgot that the dark is where I am strongest." I let the darkness expand. It swallowed the plateau, the manor, and the valley. For miles in every direction, the sun worshippers were plunged into a total, terrifying eclipse. I could hear their screams, their whimpers of please, and the frantic scratching of paws against a ground they could no longer see. I wasn't an Omega anymore. I was the void. I looked at Sela, who was cowering in the dirt, her golden form flickering and fading. I could have ended her. I could have let the shadows consume every last one of them. But a queen doesn't just destroy. She rules. "I am leaving," I announced, my voice carried by the wind to every shivering ear in the valley. "I am going to the dead woods, to the places where you were too afraid to go. Hunt me if you dare, Varric. But remember, every step you take toward me is a step into my domain." I turned and walked into the forest. The shadows didn't follow me. They paved the way, parting the trees and silencing the earth. The great shift was over. The Soulblood hadn't gained a new warrior. They had birthed their own eclipse. And for the first time in 18 years, the iron was gone. I was free, and I was hungry. Chapter 2. The Deadwoods earned their name for a reason. Here, the canopy was so thick that the sun's blessing couldn't reach the forest floor. The trees were twisted, skeletal things, their bark gray and peeling like dead skin. For the Saul blood pack, this was a graveyard. For me, it was a playground. I had been running for 3 days. My feet were bare, my clothes were rags, but for the first time in my life, I felt heavy. Not the heaviness of the iron collar, but the weight of power. A cold, liquid mercury in my veins that pulsed in time with the flickering of the leaves. Over here. I smell her. The stench of rot and ash. I heard the voice of Torin, the lead sentinel. He and 4 others were crashing through the undergrowth behind me. They were carrying sun torches, magical lanterns filled with concentrated solar energy designed to burn away shadow magic. I leaned against an ancient hollow oak, my lungs burning. I was exhausted, but as the golden light of their torches began to bleed through the trees, something inside me snapped. The fear I had carried for 18 years didn't vanish. It transformed. "Stop running," a voice whispered in the back of my mind. It sounded like my mother, but deeper, older. "The shadows are not behind you. They are you." I looked at the long, jagged shadow cast by the oak tree. I didn't just see it. I felt it like a doorway. As Torin burst into the clearing, his silver blade raised, I didn't jump away. I stepped backward, right into the darkness of the tree's shadow. It felt like falling into a pool of ice-cold silk. One moment I was standing in the clearing. The next, I was nowhere. I was the silence between heartbeats. I was the space between the atoms. I could see the sentinels, but they looked like glowing, heat-mapped ghosts in a world of gray. "Where did she go?" Torin roared, his torch flickering wildly. "She was right here. Scour the brush. She couldn't have shifted. She's a defect." I moved, but I didn't walk. I slipped. I slid through the darkness like a drop of ink in water. I appeared behind the youngest sentinel, a boy who had once thrown stones at me in the courtyard. I didn't use a knife. I simply reached out of the shadow and touched his ankle. The darkness surged from my fingertips. It didn't cut him. It unbound his light. His golden aura flickered and died, and he let out a choked scream as he was pulled feet first into the shadows of a fern. "Something's in the trees," another shouted, firing a bolt of sun energy into the dark. It missed me by miles. I was already gone, slipping from the shadow of the fern to the shadow of a rock, then to the very shadows cast by their own boots. I was the predator now. I was a ghost with a grudge. I appeared directly in front of Torin, rising out of the ground like a pillar of smoke. His eyes went wide, the reflection of my silver void eyes dancing in his pupils. "You called me a defect," I whispered, my voice coming from every direction at once. "But look at you, Torin. You're so afraid of the dark that you carry a little glass sun just to feel brave." I reached out and crushed the sun torch in his hand. The glass shattered, and the golden light was instantly swallowed by the swirling vacuum around my fingers. The clearing went pitch black. "Please," Torin whimpered, his alpha bravado vanishing as he felt the cold tendrils of the deadwoods wrapping around his limbs. "The alpha ordered it. We were just following the law." "The law of the sun is over," I said, my hand closing around his throat. "In these woods there is only one law. Mine." I didn't kill him. I did something worse. I left him there, stripped of his golden aura, blind and broken in the heart of the deadwoods. I let him hear the sounds of the things that live in the dark, things that were now my friends. As I slipped back into the shadows to find a place to rest, I realized the truth. I wasn't an exile. I was an invader. And the curse that Varric had tried to suppress was the only thing that could actually save this world from its own blinding light. The air in the clearing didn't just turn cold, it turned heavy. I had dealt with the sentinels, but they were just lapdogs. The man standing 20 paces away was different. He didn't carry a flickering sun torch, and he didn't shout insults. He stood in the center of a patch of moonlight, a silhouette of sheer power. Malakai, the High Council's favorite executioner, a lunar knight who had hunted rogue alphas and shadow demons alike. He was dressed in charcoal gray leather reinforced with silver plates, a massive claymore strapped to his back. His scent wasn't just pine and fir. It was the smell of a brewing storm. "You've caused a lot of trouble for a girl who can't shift, Alara's daughter," Malakai said. His voice was like low thunder, vibrating through the soles of my feet. "I'm done being the girl you think I am," I replied, my fingers twitching. I felt the shadows around the clearing rise, their jagged edges sharpening like obsidian blades. "If you're here to take me back to Varric, you're going to need a bigger blade." Malakai didn't draw his sword. He did something much more dangerous. He took a step toward me, his eyes, usually a piercing, icy blue, beginning to swirl with a dark, liquid gold. "Varric thinks you're a rot," Malakai said, his pace steady. "The council thinks you're an omen of the end times. They told me to bring them your heart on a silver plate." I lunged. I didn't run. I slipped. I vanished into the shadow of a fallen log and reappeared behind him, my hand a claw of solid darkness aimed at the base of his skull. But Malakai was a lunar knight for a reason. He didn't even turn around. He simply shifted his weight, catching my wrist in a grip that felt like a steel trap. The darkness at my fingertips hissed as it touched his skin, but it didn't consume him. Instead, the shadows seemed to purr. "Wait!" I gasped, trying to pull away. Malakai turned then, his face inches from mine. He didn't look at me with hate. He looked at me with a terrifying primal hunger, and something else, recognition. Suddenly, a massive spectral pressure filled the clearing. It was his wolf. Most alphas had wolves that roared or snarled. Malakai's wolf felt like a mountain. It loomed over us, a titan of silver and smoke. And then, the impossible happened. The legendary hunter, the man who had never lost a duel, let go of my wrist. His knees buckled, not from weakness, but from a command he couldn't resist. He dropped to one knee in the dirt at my feet. The spectral wolf behind him didn't growl. It lowered its massive head until its muzzle touched the ground, its ears pinned back in total, absolute submission. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Kill me! That's what you're here for!" "My wolf won't let me," Malakai growled, his voice strained as he fought the instinct to bow even lower. He looked up at me, his eyes now completely obsidian, matching mine. The prophecy was wrong, or maybe it was just written by men who were afraid. "What prophecy?" "They said a Shadowbringer would destroy the world," Malakai said, his hand reaching out, not to strike, but to touch the hem of my ragged dress. "They didn't realize you weren't sent to destroy it. You were sent to claim it. My wolf doesn't see a curse, girl. It sees the eternal alpha." The air stilled. The shadows that had been lashing out in anger suddenly calmed, wrapping around both of us like a protective shroud. "The soul blood are coming," Malakai warned, his eyes searching mine. "Varric has called in the high alphas. They're going to burn these woods to find you. You can't fight them alone." "I don't need a hunter to save me," I snapped, though the cold in my chest was beginning to feel like a strange new kind of heat. "I'm not here to save you," Malakai said, standing up, though he still kept his head slightly bowed. "I'm here to serve you. You think you're a pariah? I'll show you the thousands of us who have been waiting in the dark for a queen to lead us. Give me the word, and I will show you how to turn this curse into a kingdom." I looked into his eyes and saw the truth. He wasn't my hunter. He was my first subject. "Fine," I said, the darkness in my veins singing a song of war. "Lead the way, Malakai. Let's see what the night has to say." Chapter 3. Malakai led me deeper into the deadwoods than even the sentinels dared to tread. Here, the trees were no longer wood. They were petrified bone, and the air tasted like ancient copper and cold rain. In the center of a hollowed-out mountain lay the altar of the obsidian moon, a massive slab of volcanic glass that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat I felt in my own chest. "Every wolf is born from the sun," Malakai whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade as he scanned the perimeter. They believe the moon is just a mirror, but they are wrong. The moon has its own blood, and you are the only one who can drink it. I stepped onto the glass. The moment my bare skin touched the obsidian, the iron scars on my neck, the ones left by the collar, began to glow with a violet fire. They expect you to grow fur, to break your bones, to become a beast of flesh, Malakai said, standing at the edge of the altar. But you are an Eclipse-born. Your body isn't a cage, it's a vessel. Don't fight the darkness, my queen. Dissolve into it. I closed my eyes. I didn't try to find the wolf inside. Instead, I reached for that cold vacuum in my soul that had been suppressed for 18 years. I stopped trying to be human. I stopped trying to be solid. The pain was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the cracking of bones. It was the unraveling of my very atoms. I'm disappearing, I cried out, my voice sounding like wind through a tomb. Hold on to your will, Malakai's voice commanded. You are the center of the storm. Control the shadow or it will become the grave. I saw my hands turn to black smoke. My feet vanished into the obsidian. I felt myself expanding, my consciousness stretching out until I could feel every shadow in the cavern. I could feel the heartbeat of a bat on the ceiling. I could feel the moisture on the walls. And then I pulled it all back together. I didn't become a wolf. I became the Night-Stalker. I was a creature of liquid midnight, 7 feet of elegant, terrifying shadow. I had no fur, only a hide that looked like the starry void of deep space. My eyes weren't amber or blue. They were twin pools of silver-white fire. I had claws made of solidified darkness, sharp enough to cut through the fabric of a dream. I moved, and I didn't make a sound. I wasn't walking. I was a ripple in reality. I turned toward Malakai. To my new form, he looked like a pillar of heat and light. I could see the pulse of his throat, the golden flicker of his lunar night spark. By the ancestors, Malakai breathed, dropping to both knees this time. It's beautiful. It's a nightmare. I opened my mouth, and instead of a growl, a haunting, multi-tonal hum vibrated through the cave. I reached out a shadow claw and touched the stone wall. The rock didn't break. It withered. I had drained the very existence out of the stone. They think they can fight you with silver and fire, Malakai said, looking up at me with a mixture of awe and terror. But how do you kill the dark? How do you stab a shadow? I felt a surge of predatory joy. For 18 years I had been the girl who scrubbed floors and wore an iron leash. Now I was the thing that lived under the beds of alphas. I was the reason wolves feared the night. I'm ready, I said, my voice echoing from the shadows themselves. Not yet, Malakai replied, his eyes turning toward the tunnel entrance. The outcasts are arriving, the Omegas, the broken, the ones Varric threw away like trash. They've felt your awakening. They're coming to see if the rumors are true. They're coming to see if the eclipse has finally arrived to take back the sky. I looked toward the entrance. I could feel them, hundreds of small, flickering lights in the distance. The mistakes of the world. My army. The Night-Stalker didn't just feel powerful, it felt hungry. And I knew exactly what I wanted to eat first. The arrogance of the Sol blood. The rival pack was called the Iron Claws. They were mercenaries, wolves who had grown fat and cruel by doing the High Council's dirty work. They didn't care about prophecies. They cared about the bounty Varric had placed on my head. They hit our camp at midnight, 36 warriors in mid-shift, their eyes glowing a filthy blood orange. They came with torches and silver-edged axes, laughing as they tore through the brush. They expected to find a group of shivering Omegas. They found silence. Where are they? The Iron Claw Alpha, a scarred brute named Nasher, growled. He held a torch high, peering into the dense mist of the deadwoods. I smelled the Omegas. I smelled the traitor Malakai. I was already there. I was hanging from the underside of a petrified branch directly above him, my Night-Stalker form blending perfectly into the ink of the canopy. To Nasher, I was just a patch of darkness. To me, he was a map of heat and fear. "Malakai, come out and die like a man," Nasher roared. "He isn't here, Nasher," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the trees. It came from inside his own shadow. Nasher spun around, slashing his axe at the empty air. "Who's there?" I didn't answer with words. I slipped. I dropped from the branch, but I didn't land on the ground. I vanished into the shadow cast by Nasher's torch and reappeared 10 feet away, standing in a patch of fog. I wasn't solid. I was a flickering silhouette of starlight and smoke. "Look at me," I commanded. One of the mercenaries turned, his eyes widening. He raised his silver axe, but as he swung, his own shadow rose up from the ground and grabbed his arms. He screamed, his weapon falling into the dirt as he was pinned by his own darkness. "What is this magic?" Nasher yelled, his bravado cracking. "Light the fires! Burn the woods!" The Iron Claws scrambled to light more torches, but the darkness in the deadwoods was no longer passive. It was a predator. Every time a match was struck, the shadows would leap out and snuff it. The warriors began to panic, huddled in a circle, their backs pressed against each other. I began to move through them. I didn't use claws. I used terror. I appeared beside a warrior, whispered his name into his ear, and vanished before he could turn. I appeared behind another, dragging my shadow fingers across his throat, leaving a trail of frost but no blood. I was everywhere and nowhere. I was the rustle in the leaves. I was the cold breath on their necks. "I can't see. I can't see anything," one cried out as I wrapped a veil of absolute darkness around his head. "The sun isn't coming to save you," I said, my voice echoing from the trees. "The sun is a lie told to children to keep them from seeing the truth of the night." I stepped into the center of their circle, fully manifesting my Night-Stalker form. I stood 7 feet tall, my silver fire eyes burning with a hunger that made their alpha auras flicker and die. Gnasher lunged at me, his claws extended. I didn't move. I let him pass right through me. His body felt like it was hitting a wall of liquid ice. He stumbled, gasping as the shadow rot began to seep into his lungs, turning his breath into mist. "Go back to Varric," I said, my hand closing around the air in front of his face, causing the shadows to tighten around his chest. "Tell him that the Omegas he discarded are no longer his subjects. Tell him that the Eclipse has arrived, and it is very, very hungry." I released a pulse of pure lunar energy. The shockwave sent the Iron Claws flying into the undergrowth. They didn't stay to fight. They scrambled to their feet and ran, howling in terror, leaving their silver weapons and torches behind. The forest went silent again. From the darkness behind the trees, my army began to emerge. The Omegas, the scarred, the outcasts. They looked at the fleeing mercenaries. Then they looked at me. They didn't see a defect. They saw a goddess. Malakai stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with pride. "You didn't kill them." "No," I said, my form slowly dissolving back into my human skin, though my eyes remained silver. "Dead men can't spread fear. I want the soul blood to know that the dark is no longer empty. I want them to jump at every shadow." I looked toward the direction of my old home. "The harvest has begun, Malakai. It's time to show them that the night doesn't just belong to me. It is me." Chapter 4. The first sign that my uncle had lost his mind wasn't a sound. It was the smell. It wasn't the scent of pine or damp earth anymore. It was the smell of ozone and burning sap. I stood on the border of the dead woods, the Night-Stalker humming beneath my skin. Beside me, Malakai gripped the hilt of his blade, his eyes narrowed at the horizon. The sky over Shadowvale wasn't blue, and it wasn't gold. It was a searing, sickly white. "He's done it," Malakai hissed, his voice thick with dread. "The fool actually went to the Soul Keepers. He's activated the Sunstone." In his desperation to find me, to burn the Shadowbringer out of the brush, Alpha Varric had broken the most sacred law of the shifter world. He had forced a permanent noon. Through the trees, I could see the devastating effects of the eternal sun. The forest was dying. The ancient oaks were curling inward, their leaves turning to ash before they even hit the ground. The rivers were receding into cracked mud, and the animals, wolves and prey alike, were collapsing from the unrelenting heat. The balance was gone. Varric wasn't just trying to kill me. He was lobotomizing the world. "The pack is dying, my queen," a young Omega named Kale whispered behind me. He had escaped Shadowvale only hours ago, his fur singed and his eyes bloodshot. "The Alpha says the heat is my fault. He says the sun is purifying the land because of your rot. But the pups, they can't breathe." I felt a surge of cold fury that eclipsed the heat of the sky. For 18 years, they told me I was the curse. They told me I was the reason the world would end. But here was the pure Alpha, the Lightbringer, murdering the very land he was sworn to protect because he couldn't handle a shadow he couldn't control. "He's creating a wasteland," I said, my voice echoing with a hollow metallic resonance. "He thinks if he removes the shadows, I'll have nowhere to hide." "He's right," Malakai said, looking at a patch of ground where the grass was literally turning to dust. "If the shadows vanish, your slip becomes useless. You'll be a human girl standing in a furnace." I looked at my hands. They were trembling, not with fear, but with the pressure of the Night-Stalker. The shadows around me were shrinking, retreating into the tiny slivers beneath the rocks. "I won't hide anymore," I said, the silver in my eyes flaring into a blinding chrome. "He wants to bring the sun to the earth? Fine, I'll bring the moon to his doorstep." I stepped out from the canopy. The moment the unnatural white light hit my skin, it felt like being branded with 1,000 needles. My iron scars pulsed with a violent violet light. I didn't retreat. I didn't slip. I reached out with my spirit and touched the dying shadows of the forest. I felt their pain. I felt the thirst of the roots and the exhaustion of the earth. "I am the Eclipse," I whispered to the scorched ground, "and I do not permit this light." I unleashed a pulse of lunar frost, a wave of silver energy that surged forward, momentarily cooling the air and turning the white light into a soft, hazy violet. It wasn't a victory. It was a challenge. Deep in the valley, the sunstone pulsed in response, a beam of blinding white light shooting into the sky like a spear. Varric had declared war on the cycle of nature itself. He thought the sun was his weapon. He was about to find out that even the sun has to set. "Gather the outcasts," I told Malakai, my form beginning to blur and shift as the Night-Stalker fought to emerge despite the heat. "We aren't raiding anymore. We are reclaiming. Tell the pack that the night is coming for its throne." The march through the valley was a journey through a furnace. My army of outcasts, hundreds of Omegas, broken warriors, and lunar-touched rebels, followed me through a landscape that looked like the surface of a dying star. The heat from Varric's sunstone was so intense that the air shimmered, distorting the horizon into a wavy, hellish dream. "They're falling, my queen," Malakai grunted, his silver armor now so hot it was blistering his skin. Behind us, the weaker wolves were collapsing, their tongues parched, their spirits breaking under the weight of the pure light. I stopped at the crest of the final hill overlooking the Shadowvale village. Below, the scene was horrific. The village was a ghost town. The once green pastures were white with ash. In the center of the square, the sunstone sat atop a pedestal of gold, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. Varric stood before it, his eyes wild and bloodshot, his golden fur falling out in clumps. He was being consumed by the very power he had summoned. He wasn't a protector anymore. He was a zealot holding a torch to his own house. "If we move closer, the sunstone will vaporize us," Malakai warned, shielding his eyes. "Shadow magic is built on the presence of light, but this is absolute light. There are no shadows left for you to slip into, Fenris." I looked down at my hands. He was right. The light was so overhead, so omnidirectional, that I didn't even cast a shadow on the ground. I felt small. I felt human. I felt like that girl in the cellar again, waiting for a mercy that would never come. The prophecy was half written. My mother's voice echoed in the heat haze. They called you the shadow bringer because they were afraid of the dark. They forgot that the eclipse doesn't just bring the shadow, it devours the sun. I looked at my thirsty, dying people. I looked at the pups huddled in the distance, and I realized the choice wasn't about revenge anymore. To save the forest, I had to stop being the girl who hides in the dark. I had to become the void that eats the light. "Stay back," I commanded Malakai. "You'll be burned to ash," he roared, reaching for me. "Then I'll be ash that clogs his throat," I replied. I walked down the hill, straight into the heart of the sunstone's radiance. Every step was agony. My skin felt like it was peeling, my vision turning white. Varric saw me, a small, ragged figure limping through the heat. "You!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "The rot comes to be purged. Look at the glory of the soul blood. There is no room for you in a world of perfect light." I didn't answer. I reached the base of the pedestal. The sunstone was a roaring sun core, a foot away from my face. I could feel my life force flickering. I didn't slip into a shadow. I opened my mouth and inhaled. I reached deep into that vacuum in my soul, the one they called a defect, and I turned it inside out. I stopped being a container and became a singularity. The light didn't burn me. It was drawn into me. The screaming white rays began to bend, curving toward my chest like water spiraling down a drain. The air around me began to cool as I sucked the thermal energy out of the atmosphere. What are you doing?" Varric stammered, stepping back as the blinding white light of the valley began to dim into a twilight violet. "You wanted to give the world the sun, Uncle," I said, my voice now a terrifying, hollow roar that shook the very foundation of the stone. "But you forgot the most basic rule of the cosmos." My body began to expand, not into the Night-Stalker, but into something much larger, a massive winged silhouette that blotted out the sunstone entirely. "The sun is just a star," I growled, my silver eyes turning into black holes. "And I am the endless night." With a final, desperate surge, I threw my arms around the sunstone. The explosion wasn't of fire, but of silence. The light didn't flare. It vanished. I swallowed the stone's energy whole, my veins turning into rivers of glowing violet mercury. The valley plunged into a sudden, cool darkness. The heat vanished. The breeze returned. I stood over the shattered remains of the pedestal, my skin glowing with the stolen light of 1,000 midnights. I had made my choice. I was no longer the girl who was cursed by the eclipse. I was the one who controlled when the sun was allowed to shine. Chapter 5. The silence that followed the sunstone's destruction was heavier than the heat. For a moment, nobody moved. The air was cool, blessedly, terrifyingly cool, and the sky had returned to a bruised purple twilight. I stood at the center of the village square, my lungs burning with the stolen solar energy I was currently forcing into the void of my soul. I wasn't just standing. I was hovering an inch off the scorched earth, wisps of violet smoke rising from my skin. Behind me, the hill was suddenly alive. Hundreds of outcasts, led by Malakai, descended into the valley. They didn't come with the frantic, chaotic energy of a mob. They moved with the synchronized, silent grace of a tide. "The sunstone is gone," a loyalist shouted, a high-ranking sentinel named Kalen, who had been one of Varric's most brutal enforcers. He lunged forward, trying to rally the remaining Sunblood warriors. "She's drained the light. Kill her before the darkness becomes permanent." About 50 loyalists, the pure elites who had thrived under Varric's cruelty, stepped forward. They bared their fangs, their golden eyes dim but desperate. They looked at my army of broken wolves and laughed. "Look at them," Kalen sneered, pointing a silver spear at a scarred Omega woman who had lost an eye to his whip years ago. A pack of cripples and runaways. You think a little shade makes you warriors? I stepped forward, the ground beneath my feet cracking as the shadows from the surrounding buildings began to elongate, crawling toward the loyalists like snakes. They aren't runaways anymore, I said, my voice resonating through the marrow of everyone present. They are the foundations. You built your palace on their backs, and you expected them to stay down. But you forgot one thing about the dark, Kalen. The shadows reached the feet of my army. Instead of fleeing, the Omegas stepped into them. Suddenly, the cursed wolves began to change. Because I had swallowed the sunstone, the veil wasn't just gone from me. It was gone from the entire territory. Every defect who had been told they were weak because they couldn't handle the sun suddenly found their true frequency. The scarred Omega didn't turn into a golden wolf. She became a blur of silver-gray fur and shadow smoke, her missing eye replaced by a glowing lunar spark. The crippled boy found his limbs reinforced by solidified darkness. The new law is simple, I announced, as my army of shadow wolves surrounded the stunned loyalists. The sun will no longer be used as a whip. Strength will no longer be measured by the brightness of your fur. From this day on, we do not worship the light. We govern it. The Omegas realized it then. The curse they had carried, the sensitivity to the dark, the shiftless nature, the cold skin, wasn't a mark of failure. It was the biological requirement for the next era. They were the only ones who could function in the world I had just created. Choose, I said to the loyalists, the Night-Stalker wings unfurling behind me, blotting out what little light remained. Submit to the cycle, or be consumed by the vacuum you created. Kalen looked at his men. They looked at the hundreds of shadow wolves whose eyes were glowing with a terrifying, unified silver light. The pure wolves, the ones who had mocked us for 18 years, were suddenly the ones trembling. They realized that in a world without a sunstone, they were just dogs in the dark. One by one, the loyalists dropped their weapons. Not out of loyalty, but out of the sheer primal realization that the food chain had just flipped. "Where is Varric?" Malakai asked, stepping up beside me, his own shadow cloak billowing. I looked toward the Alpha's manor, the great golden doors now tarnished and cast in deep gloom. "He's in the throne room. He thinks he's still a king. Let's go show him that the sun has finally set." The doors to the great hall didn't just open, they disintegrated. I walked through the dust of the shattered oak, my footsteps echoing in a room that had once been a temple of golden opulence. Now the tapestries were scorched, and the air smelled of ozone and my uncle's rotting fear. Varric was waiting on the throne. He had forced himself into a partial shift, a grotesque, hulking form of matted golden fur and bulging muscles. In his hand, he held the scepter of soul, a relic pulsing with the last dying embers of the sunstone's power. "You miserable, shiftless whelp," Varric roared, his voice cracking with madness. "I should have drowned you in the birthing cave. You've stolen the light. You've brought the plague of the void into my house." "I didn't steal anything, Uncle," I said, my voice steady, my form flickering between girl and shadow. "I simply stopped the thief. You've been stealing the life of this valley for 18 years to fuel your own vanity." Varric lunged. He moved with the desperate speed of a dying star. The scepter of soul flared, a beam of concentrated white fire shooting toward my heart. I didn't dodge. I didn't slip. I raised my hand and caught the beam. The white fire hissed against my skin, but instead of burning me, it flowed into the violet mercury of my veins. I was a battery for his rage. "My turn," I whispered. I didn't strike him with my fists. I reached out and grabbed his shadow. Under the flickering light of the scepter, Varric's shadow was long and jagged. I gripped it as if it were a physical rope. As I pulled, Varric let out a scream that sounded like tearing metal. His own shadow began to crawl up his body, wrapping around his limbs like liquid obsidian. What is this?" he gasped, his golden fur turning black where the shadow touched him. "This is the weight of every omega you broke," I said, taking a step forward. The shadows tightened around his throat. "This is the cold of every winter I spent in that cellar. This is the silence of my mother's grave." I forced the shadow to manifest his own guilt. The darkness didn't just bind him, it showed him. Every lash of the whip, every cruel word, every moment he spent worshipping the sun while his people starved in the heat, it all flooded back into him through the shadow link. Varric's eyes, once arrogant and golden, turned dull and gray. He wasn't fighting me anymore. He was fighting the reflection of his own soul. "Stop! Please!" he wheezed, the scepter of soul falling from his nerveless fingers and shattering on the floor. "The sun doesn't ask for permission to shine, Varric," I said, standing over him as he collapsed at the foot of his own throne. "And the eclipse doesn't ask for permission to end it. You wanted a world of pure light. You forgot that the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow it casts." I didn't tear his throat out. I didn't need to. I commanded his shadow to sink into his skin, permanently binding his soul spark. He didn't die, but he would never shift again. He was now what he had mocked me for being, shiftless, human, hollow. I turned away from the broken man and looked at the great hall. Malakai and the outcasts stood at the entrance, the silver light of their eyes illuminating the darkness. I walked to the throne, not to sit on it, but to touch the stone. I pulsed a wave of calm, balanced energy through the manor. The violet fire died down, replaced by the natural, soft glow of the moon beginning to rise through the shattered roof. "The duel is over," I announced. "The Sunblood is dead. Long live the Eclipse Coven." The roar that followed wasn't a wolf's howl. It was the sound of 1,000 souls finally being allowed to breathe. The siege was over. The kingdom was mine. But as I looked at Malakai, I knew the High Council wouldn't let a Shadowbringer rule in peace. The war for the sky had only just begun. Chapter 6. The coronation didn't take place at high noon. We held it at the exact moment of the midnight transit, under a moon that seemed to glow with a new obsidian luster. The village square of Shadow Vale had been transformed. The scorched earth was now covered in a carpet of night-blooming jasmine, and the broken pedestal of the sunstone had been replaced by a monolith of pure, unpolished basalt. Thousands of wolves, my shadow wolves, stood in silent rows, their silver eyes creating a sea of starlight in the valley. I stood atop the monolith, wearing robes woven from spider silk and dipped in the mercury of the dead sunstone. Malakai stood behind me, his claymore drawn and held against his chest in a salute that only a lunar night can give to a god. "We do not bow to the sun," Malakai's voice rang out, amplified by the silent air of the night. "We do not fear the dark. We are the children of the eclipse, and here stands our queen." The roar that erupted from the crowd wasn't a wolf's howl. It was a rhythmic, guttural chant that shook the very mountains. For the first time in 18 years, I didn't feel the iron collar. I didn't feel the weight of the defect. I felt the entire valley breathing with me, but the celebration was short-lived. From the northern pass, a blast of trumpets, made of pure gold and enchanted to pierce the night, shattered the harmony of the chant. A fleet of white and gold airships, bearing the banners of the High Council of the Seven Peaks, descended into the valley. They landed with an arrogant, heavy thud, their engines blowing back the jasmine petals. A ramp lowered, and 3 figures stepped out. They were the pure kings, the king of Frostfang, the king of Emberclaw, and the king of Ironhide. They were massive, their auras radiating a heat so intense it felt like a physical slap to the face. "So," the Frostfang king sneered, his white fur trimmed in diamonds. "The rumors were true. The defect has crawled out of her cellar and started playing queen." The Emberclaw king stepped forward, his eyes burning with a literal flame. By order of the High Council, this Eclipse coven is declared a heretical biological anomaly. You have 1 hour to surrender the girl, dissolve your ranks, and accept the rite of purification, which involves the total silver burning of your bloodlines. My army growled, a sound of low-frequency static that made the king's guards flinch. I felt Malakai's hand go to his sword, but I raised my palm to stop him. I stepped off the monolith. I didn't walk down the stairs. I drifted down on a cushion of solidified shadow, landing 10 feet away from the 3 pure kings. You speak of purification, as if your light hasn't already poisoned this world, I said, my voice cold and echoing, the Night-Stalker wings momentarily flickering behind my back. Look at your skin. You are bloated with sun energy you didn't earn. You are kings of a day that is ending. Enough! The Ironhide King roared, his skin turning into living metal. You are an Omega, a mistake. You have no seat at our table. Hand over your crown, or we will turn this valley into a crematorium. I don't want a seat at your table, I replied, the shadows of the entire village beginning to rise behind me, forming a wall of darkness that reached toward the sky. I am the table. And as for my crown, I reached into the air, and the shadows solidified into a crown of black diamonds and frozen moonlight that settled onto my brow. You didn't come here to demand my surrender, I said, my silver eyes locking onto the Frostfang King. You came here because you are afraid. You feel the moon changing. You feel your power slipping. And you should be. This is war, the Frostfang King yelled, signaling his guards. No, I whispered, the ground beneath the king's feet turning into a liquid shadow. This is a lesson. You have 60 seconds to get back on your ships and tell the council that the sky no longer belongs to them. Or you can stay and find out what happens when the defect decides she's done being patient. The air in the valley went stagnant. The 3 kings looked at the thousands of silver eyes watching them from the dark. For the first time in their immortal lives, they realized they weren't the predators. They were the light sources in a room full of ghosts. The Frostfang King didn't heed my warning. Instead, he laughed, a jagged, cold sound that echoed through the silent valley. You think a few parlor tricks with shadows make you our equal? He roared, his body expanding. His bones cracked and reset as he shifted into a massive, 12-foot-tall winter wolf, his fur radiating a sub-zero frost that began to kill the jasmine flowers at his feet. We were carved from the stars. You were born from a mistake. The other 2 kings shifted beside him. The Ember Claw became a beast of living magma, and the Ironhide became a juggernaut of metallic muscle. Their combined auras hit me like a solar flare, trying to burn the darkness out of my lungs. Kill the heretic, the Frostfang King commanded his legion. They lunged. A wave of golden and white fur surged toward my outcasts, but I didn't let my people fight this battle. They had suffered enough. Back, I whispered, the word carrying the force of a tectonic shift. I looked up at the moon. The obsidian luster I had cultivated wasn't just for show. I reached out and grabbed the very light of the moon, pulling it down toward me. But I didn't stop there. I reached into the earth, into the blood of the ancestors that had been spilled on this soil for centuries. I combined the vacuum of the eclipse with the crimson heat of the earth's core. The sky didn't just go dark, it turned a terrifying bruised crimson. The moon above bled, the blood moon appearing in the middle of a clear night. What is this? The Ember Claw King stammered, his magma fur flickering out in terror. I didn't answer with words. I shifted. It wasn't a wolf shift, it was a cosmic event. My skin didn't grow fur, it grew scales of solidified shadow matter. My spine lengthened into a whip of silver glass. My face didn't elongate into a muzzle. It became a mask of bone and starlight. I became the Blood Moon Wolf. I was 20 feet of primordial nightmare. My wings weren't made of feathers, but of tattered, weeping darkness that dripped like ink onto the grass. When I opened my eyes, they weren't silver anymore. They were the color of a dying sun, a deep, hungry red. I let out a howl. It wasn't a sound. It was a frequency that shattered the glass on the High Council's airships. The Frostfang King lunged at me, his icy jaws aimed for my throat. I didn't even move. I let him strike. When his teeth hit my neck, they didn't draw blood. They shattered like icicles against stone. I looked down at him, my gaze heavy with the weight of eons. I reached out a clawed hand and touched his head. The pure gold of his aura didn't just dim, it turned into ash. In seconds, the legendary King of the North was reduced to a shivering, hairless pup, his power completely drained into the void of my palm. "Your son is a candle," I said, my voice vibrating through the very marrow of the earth. "And I am the wind that blows it out." The Emberclaw and Ironhide Kings turned to run, their arrogance replaced by a frantic, animalistic terror. They scrambled toward their ships, but the shadows of the valley rose up like iron bars, locking them into the square. I didn't kill them. I did something far more permanent. I unleashed a wave of blood moon radiation. The crimson light washed over the entire legion of the High Council. It didn't burn their flesh, it rewrote their souls. It stripped away the Alpha command they had used to enslave the Omegas for centuries. The kings fell to their knees, their shifts collapsing, their crowns rolling in the dirt. They looked up at me, and they didn't see a defect or a girl. They saw the apex. The airships of the High Council turned and fled into the night, their pilots terrified of the shadow that now dominated the horizon. The Seven Peaks would hear of this. They would know that the Shadowbringer wasn't a myth to be feared. She was a reality to be obeyed. I slowly dissolved back into my human form, though the silver crown remained fixed on my head, and my eyes kept their faint crimson ring. I looked at Malakai and my army of shadow wolves. They were no longer the broken. They were the new elite. The world of the Sunblood was over. The era of night and blood had begun. "Clean the square," I said, my voice returning to its calm, cold silk. "And tell the other packs, if they want to see the sun again, they have to ask me for permission." The valley erupted in a roar that reached the stars. I wasn't the girl who stole the sun. I was the one who finally gave the world its shadows back. The epilogue. They used to call me a defect, now they call me the celestial anchor. 5 years have passed since the day the Seven Kings knelt in the dust of Shadow Vale. The world doesn't look the way it used to. The blinding, oppressive glare of the Sunblood era has softened into a permanent, silver-hued twilight that the scholars now call the Gleaming. I sit upon the obsidian throne, carved from the very heart of the mountain where I first learned to become the Night-Stalker. At my right hand stands Malakai, no longer a hunter of shadows, but the general of the Lunar Guard. We don't hunt rogues anymore, we hunt the remaining fragments of tyranny. The Shadow Vale is no longer a cellar. It is a sprawling cathedral of nature and stone, where the broken and the outcasts have built a civilization that values the soul over the shift. Here, the Omegas are the architects, their sensitivity to the environment allowing them to grow forests that heal the scars Varric left behind. But the most significant change isn't in the landscape, it's in the sky. Every evening, as the sun begins to set, I walk to the balcony of the void. I reach out and touch the horizon, guiding the light down with the same ease as a mother tucking in a child. I realized long ago that the prophecy of the Shadowbringer was only scary to those who wanted to hide their crimes in the light. To everyone else, the shadow is rest. The shadow is truth. "The delegation from the Frost Peaks has arrived, my queen," Malakai whispers, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "They bring gifts of ice amber and a request for a trade treaty. They've stopped calling us the Cursed Pack." I smile, a cold but satisfied curve of my lips. "Tell them I will hear them when the moon reaches its zenith, not a moment before." As he leaves, I look down at my lap, where a small, sleeping bundle is wrapped in silk. My daughter, Lyra, was born just 3 months ago. The pack held their breath during her birth, wondering if she would be a sun wolf or a Night-Stalker. She is neither. When she opens her eyes, they don't glow golden and they aren't voids of silver. They are a perfect crystalline violet, the color of the exact moment day meets night. She represents the balance. She is the proof that the eclipse wasn't an end, but a beginning. I looked at the stars one last time before retreating into the warmth of the manor. I discovered a secret in those stars during my long nights of meditation. The universe isn't made of light punctuated by darkness. It is made of darkness, and the light is just a guest. I am no longer the girl born during an eclipse. I am the mother of the new world. And as long as I breathe, the sun will never burn my people again. The night is ours, and it is beautiful.